Before there were books, before even the alphabet took root in Greek soil, there was the voice, a voice that echoed beside flickering fires, in the rhythm of oars upon wine-dark seas, a voice that wove gods and men, wrath and love, death and memory into song. They called him Homer. Yet who was he? A blind bard walking from village to village? A school of singers preserving ancient war tales? Or perhaps a name given to memory itself? To a chorus of lives long vanished? We do not know, and perhaps we never will. But across the centuries, something survived. Not just words, but breath, cadence, emotion. Sing, muse, begins the Iliad, with the command of one who knows that stories matter more than certainty. That myth can tell us truths facts never could. In this journey, we will walk the ruins of Troy. We will follow the trail of Odysseus, drifting far from Ithaca. We will sit with philosophers, emperors, scribes, all who tried to grasp the echo of that voice. And in the end, we may not find Homer, but we will find ourselves in rage, in longing, in wonder. Let us begin, and if you listen closely, the song has already started. The wind whispers across the Ionian coast. Olive branches sway. The sea murmurs its endless refrain, salt and memory. And somewhere among the narrow stone paths of an ancient settlement, a figure moves. Slowly, gently, a staff tapping upon earth. Eyes that do not see, yet somehow know. This is how tradition remembers him. Blind, old, a singer with the power to conjure gods from silence. But even this is legend. Homer Gistimi Gista. If that was ever truly his name, did not leave us a signature. No scroll bears his handwriting. No statue of his face from life remains. What we have is song. And that song begins not with certainty, but with wonder. Imagine the world of his youth, a Greece barely emerging from darkness. A world where Mycenaean palaces had long since fallen, and the great stone fortresses were already ruins. Where people spoke of ancestors who fought monstrous wars, yet could no longer build the cities those ancestors had raised. Writing had vanished. What remained was voice. In this age, stories lived only as long as they were told. They were passed from one mouth to another, memorized in rhythm, embedded in verse. Memory was not luxury, it was survival. And among the keepers of memory stood the Aoidoi, the bards, poets of the lyre, shaping the old tales with breath and instrument. Some wandered, others stayed at court, but all served the same sacred duty, to hold the past in their voice. It is here that we meet Homer, not as a name chiseled in marble, but as a possibility among these singers. Perhaps a real man, sharp of mind, worn by travel, blind in sight but piercing in vision. Or perhaps a group of poets who, over generations, refined the same two great songs, until they shimmered with something close to perfection. Still, there are whispers. Ancient biographies, written centuries later, offer fragments, like light through cracked pottery. One says he was born on Chios, another in Smyrna. Another claims he wandered to Cyprus or even Egypt. Some call him a beggar who sang for scraps, others a prophet. The truth dissolves in contradiction, but across these tales a figure emerges, not a king, not a conqueror, but a voice, one shaped by silence, one tuned to grief, honor, longing. And then there is the blindness. Why do so many insist Homer could not see? Perhaps it was symbolic. Blindness as vision turned inward. The poet who sees not the world, but into its soul. Or perhaps it was metaphor born from Plato's later musings, that the true poet is inspired, not rational. A vessel, not a craftsman. And yet, perhaps he truly was blind, and it was in that darkness he built worlds. Imagine it, a man without sight, navigating the world through sound. Every breath of wind, every note of the lyre, every whispered word from an elder, taken in like scripture. His memory becomes his canvas, his voice, the brush. And into that darkness, he calls down gods. Apollo, swift and radiant. Athena, wise and cold. Zeus, eternal thunder. And men. Oh yes, the men, flawed and beautiful. Achilles, blazing like fire and doomed to ash. Odysseus, clever as a storm is sly. Hector, noble even in defeat. These are not paper-thin characters. They breathe, they suffer, they yearn. And that is Homer's miracle. In a world of crumbling ruins and scattered tribes, he did not simply remember the past. He remade it. He gathered fragments of songs, of names, of battles long sung, and wove them into something new. Not history, but memory reimagined. Alive, immortal. Sing, muse, of the wrath of Achilles. With that single line, he binds himself to something older than writing, yet as enduring. Was it Homer himself who composed it? Or did he give shape to something already ancient, like a sculptor revealing the form inside marble? We cannot say. But in this moment, by this imaginary fire, on this quiet shore, we feel him. Not as a ghost, but as a presence. The old man who may have once stood beneath these very stars. Head tilted back, mouth open, eyes closed, and from his chest a voice that carried the world. A voice still heard, still remembered, still waiting. The Aegean gleams like hammered bronze beneath the sun. Across its waves drift the ghostly shadows of ships, imagined or remembered, bearing warriors to Troy or merchants to forgotten isles. But this is no heroic age. This is the time after collapse. A time of scattered villages, broken palaces, and songs that remember what hands can no longer build. Welcome to Homer's world. Not the grandeur of Mycenae, not the shining halls of Agamemnon, or the great lions that once stood watch. Those were the stories of ancestors. But by Homer's time, if he lived in the 8th century BCE, as scholars now suggest, those things were rubble. What remained was ruin and memory. A memory carried by people who lived among fallen stones and wondered who had raised them. Shepherds who grazed their flocks beside crumbled walls, unaware that centuries earlier kings had walked there. This is the paradox of Homer's world. It is both ancient and young, both born from the past and desperately reaching for it. The Bronze Age had ended in fire, cities burned, trade routes vanished, scripts like Linear B were forgotten. What had been a vibrant, connected world retreated into isolation. And yet, slowly, tentatively, life began again. Villages clustered around fertile land. Small sanctuaries rose in the names of old gods. Potters turned their wheels. Blacksmiths struck their anvils. And in the smoky air of hearth and hall, songs were sung. Songs of what had come before, of mighty heroes and wrathful gods, of a time when men were greater, when fate still bowed to honor, when the world was wide and full of peril. But these were not simple tales. They were echoes, shaped by centuries of retelling, of reshaping, of breathing new life into ancient griefs. It was in this liminal space, between forgetting and remembering, that Homer's epics took root. Imagine the atmosphere. A coastal town in Ionia, perhaps Smyrna or Chios. The sun has dipped behind the hills, casting the sea in a copper hush. Fishermen return with their catch. Children chase the last warmth of day. And somewhere, in a square or courtyard, the bard begins. No stage, no scroll, just voice. He sings of Ilium, that distant city of walls and weeping. Of men who once sailed to war for a stolen bride. of gods who watched, amused, or enraged, of honor so heavy it could crush a man beneath its golden shield. And the people listen. Some know the names, others only the rhythm, but all feel the weight. Because in Homer's Greece, the past is not dead. It's the scaffolding of identity. To remember the Trojan War is not to recite history. It is to feel continuity, to say, we are the descendants of heroes, even if those heroes were made of song. What's striking, though, is that Homer's world, this world that listens, is not uniform. It is a patchwork of dialects, of customs, of isolated communities slowly reknitting the fabric of shared culture. In the north, they speak Aeolic. In Ionia, they blend old Mycenaean traces with new tongue. Across the sea, colonies sprout, each a little mirror of memory. And in the midst of it all, poetry becomes the thread. Epic song travels more easily than trade goods. A good bard is welcomed like royalty, fed and honored. His performance is both entertainment and ritual. It binds listeners to a common past. And so, in a Greece without books, Homer's epics are not just art, they are glue. But what exactly did Homer inherit? Archaeology gives us pieces. The Mycenaean world, with its warrior kings, boar tusk helmets, and shaft graves. The collapse that followed, economic, political, cultural. The centuries of quiet that came after. Then, the murmur of rebirth. Iron replaces bronze. Pottery finds new forms. Small cities rise. And most important of all, the alphabet returns. Borrowed from the Phoenicians, Greek writing begins to emerge. Not in courts, but on pottery shards. Not to keep ledgers, but to speak to the gods. Inscriptions, offerings, oaths. And at some point, perhaps around Homer's lifetime, someone decides to do something extraordinary. To write down the song, not merely words, but rhythm, meter, formula. The great epics are not poems in the modern sense. They are composed in dactylic hexameter, a rhythm as strict as the tide, as fluid as wind through grass. Within that pattern, bards could improvise, recite, recall. And for centuries, the Iliad and Odyssey lived solely in this tradition. Passed from lips to ears, never fixed, always living. But now, in this land of echoes, someone brings ink to memory. And suddenly, the voice becomes text. It is difficult to overstate what this meant. Homer's Greece had never seen its own stories written. To capture them was to risk freezing them, turning breath into stone. But it also meant they could endure. No longer reliant on the fragile thread of oral memory, the epics could travel farther, last longer. They could be copied, studied, debated. They could change history, not by describing it, but by shaping how it was imagined. And it all began here, in a world rebuilding itself. A world half remembered, half reinvented. A world of ruin and song, where a blind poet, or perhaps a dozen poets, looked out across the twilight Aegean and saw not only the sea, but the sea as it had once been, and might be again.
Sing, God.
The sea is not simply water in Homer's world. It is fate. It is trial. It is the road between men and memory. Its waves shimmer like silver in moonlight and growl like beasts in storm. And at its edge stands the singer, the Aoidos, alone but for his voice. Homer's Greece was a maritime world. To live was to live near water, to travel by it, to fear and revere it. The Aegean was not a barrier. It was the pulse of culture itself. And so the bard became a mariner of memory. He carried no sail, but with each performance he crossed vast distances, between generations, between truth and myth, between silence and song. The Aoidos, the oral poet, was not merely a storyteller. He was a vessel, carrying cargo older than himself. Not cargo of things, but of names, deeds, formulas, images. Think of him like this. A man arrives in a village. He's been walking for days. The people gather. there is bread, perhaps wine. The sun dips. And when the world softens into shadow, he begins to sing. He sings of Troy, of Hector dragging Achilles to the edge of ruin, of Andromache at the wall, of fire and fate. He sings of home, of Odysseus sailing the edge of the known world, of sirens and cyclopes, of longing and lies and the softness of a bed too long empty. His voice must hold the crowd. It must flow without falter. The rhythm, the meter, the stock phrases, all carefully learned, all deeply memorized. But within those rules, there is freedom. Each performance is both ancient and new. That is the paradox of Homeric song. It is oral but structured, improvised but precise. To modern ears, this sounds strange. How can something be both made up and inherited? But for the Aoidos, the building blocks were always the same. Epithets, scenes, similes, tools from a shared poetic toolkit. A rosy-fingered dawn, the wine-dark sea. Swift-footed Achilles. Wily Odysseus. Phrases repeated across verses not because the poet was lazy, but because they fit the meter, and because they helped carry the song through time. They were memory's scaffolding. To hear Homer sung, not read, was to witness the past being performed into the present. And this performance wasn't solitary. It was communal. It lived in the ears of those who listened. In a world without books, memory lived in the many. The song was a shared thing, each audience member a potential guardian of the tale. And in this way, the Aoidos was not an artist alone, but a channel through which the voice of a people spoke. The singer stood upon the strand, but the sea sang with him. And it is in the character of Odysseus that we most clearly see the reflection of the bard himself. Odysseus, the man of many turns, resourceful, lying when needed, weeping when alone, able to navigate storm and story alike. Is he not, in a way, the perfect avatar for the Aoidos? Both travel endlessly. Both survive through wit and words. Both craft tales that win them not just survival, but immortality. Odysseus tells stories within the story. He weaves lies that feel like truth, and truths that slip like sand. He is, like Homer, a master of narrative. And perhaps that is why the Odyssey feels so personal. It is not simply an adventure tale. It is a meditation on distance, on the ache of return, on the cost of memory. Every time Odysseus tells someone who he is, we wonder, is he telling the truth or performing? And every time Homer sings, we wonder the same. Was there truly a Trojan War? Were these men real? Or are they dreams that grew muscle through centuries of retelling? But to the Greeks, it didn't matter. What mattered was Kleos. Glory sung, not glory lived. For in song, even the fallen rise again. Achilles dies. Hector dies. Even Odysseus in time will fade. But as long as the Aoidos sings, they live. And so the singer, though mortal, holds power over immortality. A voice standing at the shore of forgetfulness, refusing to let the tide wash the names away. There is something profoundly human here. Before written history, before science or philosophy, we needed stories, not just to entertain, but to endure. Homer's epics gave Greece a past, even if that past was imagined. And the bard who bore those tales, who traveled by foot or ship from island to island, singing of wrath and return, he was both historian and priest, a keeper of sacred things. In later years, the role of the Aoidos would change. With the rise of written texts, bards became rhapsodes, reciters of fixed poems, not creators. The fluid became rigid, the living song fossilized. But in Homer's time, it still breathed. And so we imagine him there, by firelight, lyre in hand, eyes closed. The crowd leans forward, children stare, Elders nod. He sings not for applause. He sings to remember, to conjure, to hold back the night just a little longer. And in that moment, the singer is the sea, vast, mysterious, endlessly deep. The Iliad begins with a single word, wrath. Not a greeting, not a setting, not a gentle invocation, just rage. Menin Ede, Thea, sing, goddess of the wrath. It is a beginning that burns, a strike of lightning in silence, and from it, the entire world of the Iliad unfolds, not as history, but as flame. We must ask, why wrath? Why not glory or love or fate? Because wrath, in Homer's world, is not merely emotion. It is momentum. It is the engine that drives men to greatness and ruin alike. In this, the Iliad is not a chronicle of a war. It is the anatomy of a wound. The war at Troy, already 10 years old when the poem begins, serves only as backdrop. The siege, the battles, even Helen, they are smoke. The fire is Achilles, a man torn between two deaths, the death of his pride and the death of his body. His wrath is not momentary, it is operatic. It echoes across plains and centuries. He refuses to fight. He lets his countrymen fall. And when his dearest friend, Patroclus, dies, he returns with a vengeance that shatters gods and mortals alike. But Homer does not flatter Achilles. He does not crown him a hero. He does not offer redemption. He offers grief. Achilles kills Hector, drags his body in the dust. And still, it is not enough. Because the story is not about victory. It is about what wrath leaves behind. And that is where Homer becomes timeless. In a world where most epic tales glorify war, he lingers on its cost. He gives us the weeping of Andromache, the pleas of Priam, an old man begging for his son's body, the silence of Achilles as he finally returns the corpse and sees in Priam not a foe but a mirror. This is not a poem of triumph. It is a funeral. And in that funeral, Homer reveals his truest genius, his compassion. For he does not merely sing of Greeks. He gives the Trojans dignity. He lets Hector love. He lets Priam mourn. He lets even the enemy be human. That is what elevates the Iliad above mere propaganda. It is not the song of one side. It is the lament of a civilization haunted by its own past. A world remembering a war it both glorified and regretted. And Homer stands at the center, not condemning, not celebrating, but bearing witness. Imagine him composing the scenes, each line heavy with purpose, each simile opening a window into the natural world. A spear flies like a hawk diving. A warrior falls like a tree struck by lightning. Blood spills like dark wine on dust. In these images, war becomes ritual. It is not sanitized. It is not made heroic. It is made real, terrifying, strange, majestic. There is no safety in the Iliad, no armor against fate. Even the gods, powerful as they are, bicker and blunder, unable to stop what must come. Because in the heart of this poem lies an unflinching truth. Death gives meaning to life, and glory, that fragile flame, can only exist in its shadow. Achilles knows this. It torments him. He was told, "Fight, and you'll die young but be remembered forever. Stay home, and you'll live, but fade." And so he chooses song. He chooses to become fire. And Homer, centuries later, lights that fire again, not to praise violence, but to understand it. What kind of world sings its heroes into immortality, only to weep at what they've done? Homer's, ours. The Iliad ends not with triumph, but with tenderness. A father kisses the hand of his son's killer. A killer weeps for what he cannot undo. And Troy, still standing, prepares to mourn. The war is not over, but the song stops here, not with a bang, with grief. And that silence is thunderous. It echoes beyond the poem, into every age that reads it, into every soldier who returns home, every parent who buries a child, every voice that dares to ask, what did it cost? This is why the Iliad endures, not because it tells us what happened, but because it tells us what it felt like. To be proud, to be broken, to be human. And perhaps in the flickering firelight where the bard first sang it, surrounded by listeners who had lost brothers, fathers, sons, that is all they wanted. Not answers, but understanding. A song that held their sorrow and sang it back to them. The war is over. Troy burns. Its towers collapse in flame and dust, and the Greek king sets sail across a sea that no longer sings of glory, only loss. But the story is not done. In many ways, it is just beginning. Because the Iliad is about wrath and its cost. But the Odyssey is about longing. It is about the ache of return. And the man who becomes the ache itself. Odysseus. He is not the strongest, not the noblest, not the most divine, but he is the most human. And it is through him that Homer gives voice to a different kind of hero. Not one who charges into battle, but one who endures. One who survives. When we meet Odysseus, he is not sailing toward victory. He is stranded, broken, lost among islands that do not know his name. Trapped on Calypso's shore, held by a goddess who offers him immortality. And he weeps, because he does not want paradise. He wants home. That single idea, nostos, homecoming, runs like a thread through every page of the Odyssey. And not just for Odysseus. Penelope waiting in silence, weaving and unweaving. Telemachus, growing in the absence of a father. Even the suitors, drunk on their delusions, refuse to leave a house they do not own. Everyone in the Odyssey is trying to return. To a time, to a place, to a self they fear has been lost. And yet, the path is never straight. Odysseus faces monsters, yes. The Cyclops, the Lastrygonians, Scylla and Charybdis. But more dangerous than beasts are illusions. The Lotus Eaters, who tempt forgetfulness. Circe, who turns men into pigs not out of cruelty, but insight. The Sirens, whose song offers knowledge so pure it kills. Odysseus must not only survive these trials, he must remember who he is. That is his greatest task. In the Odyssey, identity is everything. A man can be a king one day and a beggar the next. He can tell a dozen lies and still be true. He can lose everything and yet still return. And Homer plays with this. He shows us Odysseus lying again and again, telling strangers he's from Crete, from Egypt, from nowhere. He is a shapeshifter, a trickster, a survivor. But underneath the disguises, he carries one unchanging truth. He longs to see Ithaca, and that longing is more powerful than gods, more enduring than wrath. What makes the Odyssey so strange, so tender, is that it moves through worlds we do not expect from an epic. It is intimate. It begins not with thunder, but with absence. A wife at her loom, a son asking questions, a man lost on the sea. It does not glorify battle. It mourns the wounds left behind. Odysseus is a hero not because he slays, but because he weeps. He is clever. Yes, but also tired, and when he finally returns home, not in a chariot but in rags, he must win back what was always his. Not by sword, but by silence, by watching, by knowing. Penelope too watches. She does not run to embrace him, she tests, she waits. Because in Homer's world, love must also remember. And that moment, when she finally believes, is among the most powerful in all of literature. Not a kiss, but a secret, a shared memory of their bed, rooted in the earth. something no imposter could know. It is here that the Odyssey reveals its heart. It is not about return as a rival. It is about return as recognition. To come home is not just to cross distance, it is to be seen again, to be known. And in a world where the self is so easily lost, in war, in disguise, in time, this is a kind of miracle. Homer knew this. Whether he walked those Ionian shores himself or not, he understood that memory is not just backward-looking. It is an anchor. It is what holds us in place, even when the sea would take us. The Odyssey is a sea poem, yes, but more than that, it is a poem of inner travel, of what it means to become, to endure, to find one's way not across a map, but back into a life. And like Odysseus, we all travel. We all long. And when we hear the final lines at the reunion, the peace, the bed unmoved, we are not just hearing a story. We are hearing a hope that we too might return. That after all the storms, we might be recognized. That someone might say our name, and it still means what it once did. That we are not lost, not yet, not forever. The song begins in darkness, not just metaphor, but real and tangible, the kind that wraps itself around the firelight, thick and absolute, before scrolls, before ink, before the scratching of quills across papyrus. There were only voices, and yet somehow, through silence and centuries, the Iliad and the Odyssey survived. How? This is the mystery, the paradox of Homer. We call him the author, but that word misleads. He did not write, at least not in the way we think. He sang. And what he sang, others remembered, copied, adapted, preserved. The epics, long thought to be the work of one mind, now seem to be the result of many, an evolving tradition carried on the tongues of countless bards. And yet, they bear the mark of something unified, something astonishingly crafted. How could that be? To answer that, we must enter the world of oral tradition, a world where poetry was performance, where memory was a skill, where the measure of greatness was not how much you wrote, but how much you remembered. The Homeric bard, or Awidos, was not a reciter of fixed texts. He was a builder. He had tools, epithets, stock phrases, patterns of meter. He had blueprints, familiar story arcs, and sacred scenes. But each performance was new, living, breathing, adapting to the moment. And yet, over time, as Greek culture shifted, something changed. The alphabet returned, borrowed from the Phoenicians, reshaped for the Greek tongue. And with it came writing. At first, it was used sparingly, to mark ownership, to make offerings to the gods. But then, someone had a vision. To capture the song. Not just notes, not just summaries, but the epics. Imagine what that would have felt like. To see words, once ephemeral, now etched in permanence. To feel the weight of the past finally given form. It was an act of preservation, but also of transformation. Because once the epics were written, they became something else. No longer songs to be shaped in the mouth of the bard, but texts to be read, analyzed, memorized. Living breath turned to symbol. This transition did not happen in a single place or moment. It was gradual, invisible. A process as quiet as dust settling on a forgotten lyre, but the consequences were vast. The Homeric poems, once fluid, became fixed. Bards became rhapsodes, reciters of the written word, not creators. And Homer? He became a name, a legend, a silhouette standing behind the pages, half seen and deeply felt. We do not know who wrote the epics down. Was it a scribe in Athens, a scholar in Ionia, a priest at a Pan-Hellenic festival? We do not know when exactly. The earliest complete texts we possess come centuries after Homer's supposed life. And yet, the style, the structure, The sheer artistry of the Iliad and Odyssey suggests something remarkable. That at some point, perhaps by one brilliant mind or a school of them, the scattered traditions were shaped into something whole. Not just stitched together, but sculpted. With rhythm, theme, balance. A vision. Whoever did it understood. Understood war not as glory, but as grief. Understood home not as place, but as longing. And that understanding, once captured in words, could finally spread. From island to island. From generation to generation. By the time of classical Athens, Homer was no longer just a poet. He was the poet. The teacher of Greece. The one whose lines boys memorized, whose verses politicians quoted, whose characters philosophers studied. He was not questioned. He was canon. Yet even as his authority grew, so did the mystery. Who was he? Some said he was a wandering bard, others a blind prophet. Still others believed Homer never existed at all, that Homer was a name for tradition itself, not a man. The Homeric question, as it came to be called, consumed scholars for centuries. Was he one person? Two? A myth? Even today, we do not know. What we do know is this, that in the darkness before history, in the space between memory and myth, a voice emerged. Whether it belonged to Homer or many like him, that voice gave shape to something eternal. It gave a defeated people a story of pride. It gave a fractured land a shared past. It gave the West its first great mirror. And in doing so, it gave us ourselves. The scrolls may crumble, the clay tablets may shatter, but the song, the one that begins in wrath and ends in return, still sings. In classrooms, in theaters, in whispered lines before sleep. The darkness that once surrounded the bard is still with us. But so too is the voice, clear, measured, unyielding. And in that voice we are reminded, what is written may fade, but what is remembered remains. They walk among us in Homer's world. The gods, not distant, not abstract, but present, immediate, intimately involved in mortal affairs. Sometimes wise, often petty, always powerful. Zeus with his thunder, Athena with her cunning, Apollo with his rage and plague-bearing arrows, Aphrodite, tender and cruel in the same breath. The gods of Homer do not reside in some unreachable heaven. They step into battlefields, whisper into dreams, disguise themselves. Love, hate, deceive. They are divine, but startlingly human. And perhaps that is the point. In Homer's cosmos, the line between God and man is not one of purity or perfection, but of scale. The gods are larger, longer-lived, unkillable, but they are not better. They are not morally superior. They are reflections, not ideals. When Aphrodite rescues Paris from death at Menelaus' hands, she does so not because it is just, but because he is her favorite. When Hera and Athena scheme against Troy, they do it out of spite, revenge, wounded pride. They play chess with lives, and the board is soaked in blood. And yet, Homer does not condemn them. He shows them as part of the order of things, as elemental. Just as storms arise, just as the sea churns, the gods too act, sometimes senselessly, sometimes with purpose, but always with consequence. And mortals, though they suffer, do not curse the sky. They endure, they bow, they act with honor despite the cruelty of fate. This is where Homer's theology becomes something more, something philosophical. He does not offer a religion. He offers a worldview, a way of understanding the human condition as suspended between two forces, divine whim and mortal will, between what we cannot control and how we choose to face it. Take Achilles. He knows his fate. His mother, Thetis, tells him plainly, "Fight, and you will die young, but be remembered forever." He chooses. And that choice, made under the shadow of inevitability, is what makes him noble. It is not strength that defines a Homeric hero. It is clarity. To act with eyes wide open, even knowing the gods may abandon you, even knowing the story may end in ruin. To live not in defiance of fate, but in full awareness of it. This is what separates Homer from later epic traditions. In Virgil's Aeneid, the gods push the plot toward destiny, and the hero, Aeneas, carries a burden of divine mission. But in Homer, there is no overarching purpose, no promised land, no divine justice to redeem the suffering. There is only the moment, the fight, the loss, the song. And through it, a kind of dignity emerges. Not because the world is fair, but because the human spirit persists despite its unfairness. We see this in the Odyssey too. Odysseus is no saint. He lies, he cheats, he defies gods and mortals alike. Yet he is not punished for his cleverness. He is praised for his endurance. The gods test him, frustrate him, rescue him. But ultimately, it is his wit and will that carry him home. And home, in Homer's world, is not given. It is earned. Athena may guide, Hermes may help, but it is the mortal who must walk the path. In this way, the gods become mirrors. They show us the scale of our humanity, how small and yet how luminous. They remind us of the world's caprice. But Homer reminds us of our courage within it. Even the gods themselves, in the end, are haunted by mortal beauty. In the Iliad, when Hector dies, the gods mourn. When Priam kisses Achilles' hands, there is a silence. Even among Olympus, as if they, too, recognize something in us that they cannot possess. Mortals die, and because they die, their choices matter more. Their grief is deeper, their joy rarer, their stories more urgent. This is the quiet truth of Homeric poetry, that the divine, for all its thunder, cannot feel what we feel. And so we become sacred through our suffering. Consider the moment when Achilles receives his new armor, forged by Hephaestus at Thetis' pleading. It is more than a gift. It is a symbol, not just of war, but of artistry. The shield, detailed in spiraling scenes of human life, feasts, dances, lawsuits, harvests, marriages, war, becomes a microcosm of the world. The divine crafts it, but it is the mortal who wears it, fights in it, dies in it. That is the balance of Homer's vision. The gods shape the stage, but it is we who must act. And though the gods may never weep, we do. And in that, we find meaning, because grief is not weakness in Homer's world. It is memory. It is proof that something mattered. When Achilles weeps for Patroclus, when Andromache wails over Hector, when Odysseus weeps in secret upon hearing a song about Troy, we are not seeing collapse, we are seeing love. That too is divine, not in the way Olympus understands, but in the way humanity remembers. And so Homer, standing somewhere between temple and battlefield, between myth and truth, gives us a world not of gods or men, but of both. A world where the sky listens, where fate speaks softly, and where even the smallest act, a tear, a word, a choice, can echo forever. It began as a voice in the dark, a song carried by memory, sung to firelight, passed from lips to ears. But in time, it became more than song. It became legacy. The name Homer, once whispered in wandering towns, would one day echo through marble halls. His verses, once improvised by bards on dusty roads, would find a home in scrolls, in libraries, in the very soul of Greek identity. The voice became a flame, and that flame would never be extinguished. By the 5th century BCE, Homer was no longer merely a poet. He was the poet. To the Athenians, he was scripture and theater, muse and monument. To the Spartans, a symbol of heroism. To the Ionian philosophers, a beginning, a doorway to deeper questions. The poems were performed at great festivals. Rhapsodes stood on platforms and recited them from memory, sometimes over several days, in competitions that crowned not warriors, but wordsmiths. In Athens, the state sponsored these recitations, ensuring that every citizen, rich or poor, could hear the old songs. This was not nostalgia. This was foundation. Homer was not just literature, he was education. Athenian boys memorized passages from the Iliad and the Odyssey as part of their moral training. They learned of courage and cunning, of loyalty and grief, not through lecture, but through poetry. Plato, despite his misgivings about poets, admitted that Homer had been the teacher of Greece. And indeed, through Homer, the Greeks learned to be Greek, to admire bravery, to value home, to question the gods, to mourn the fallen. He was woven into law, into politics, into daily speech. But his influence did not stop at Greece's borders. When Alexander the Great set out to conquer the world, he took two things to bed each night: a dagger and a copy of the Iliad. To him, Achilles was not a character. He was an ideal, a model of glory, fury, and tragic destiny. Alexander saw in Homer's verse a map for kingship, and perhaps a warning. And yet, he followed the path anyway. In Egypt, under the Ptolemies, Homer's flame was preserved again. At the Library of Alexandria, scholars labored to collect, compare, and restore every variant of the Homeric texts they could find. They collated, they cataloged, they edited. And for the first time, the Iliad and Odyssey became more than performance. They became literature, codified, canonical. Xenodotus, Aristarchus, Callimachus, names we barely remember today. But without them, the Homer we know might have vanished. They argued over every line, every word, every accent mark. They placed critical symbols in the margins, little signs to question a passage or note a repetition. And through this rigorous devotion, Homer's voice was refined, not changed, but clarified, preserved not by accident, but by obsession. By then, the poems were more than Greek. They were civilization. Rome embraced Homer with open arms. Virgil, in composing the Aeneid, modeled his epic entirely on Homer's structures. And yet, he did not merely imitate, he adapted. Where Homer embraced ambiguity and human frailty, Virgil infused purpose, destiny, empire, divine mission. But the shadow of Homer remained, because Homer did not offer answers. He offered questions. What is glory worth? What does it mean to come home? How do we live, knowing we must die? And those questions survived long after temples fell and empires collapsed. They flickered through the Middle Ages, sometimes dimmed, sometimes rekindled. Even in a Christianized Europe, where the gods of Olympus had turned to dust, Homer's stories found new life. Medieval scholars copied fragments. Renaissance thinkers studied the epics as keys to ancient virtue. And then, the printing press. Suddenly, Homer's poems, once the secret knowledge of the few, became books for the many. Translations flourished. In English, in French, in German, in Arabic. Pope, Chapman, Lattimore, Fagles, each bringing Homer into their own time, their own tongue. And always, the flame endured, not unchanged, for each age hears the voice differently. To the Enlightenment, Homer was reason and form. To the Romantics, he was passion and power. To the modern world, he is memory, fractured, tender, elusive. And yet, the song is the same. A man stands on the shore, staring into a horizon that does not return his gaze. A woman weaves at a loom, waiting for a shadow to knock. A warrior chooses wrath. A sailor chooses hope. These are not relics. They are us. In Homer, we see the unchanging heart of the human condition, the parts that war and time and technology cannot erase. We long. We struggle. We remember. And through that remembering, we endure. Even now, in lecture halls and living rooms, in late-night readings and classroom debates, Homer's voice can still be heard. Not shouting, not preaching, just singing. Softly, clearly, like a flame in the wind, flickering, but never fading. And so the fire he lit in some unknown town with no pen, no book, and only his breath, still burns. Stand before Homer's world, and you do not simply gaze into the past. You gaze into yourself. His words are not fossils. They are reflections. Reflections of longing, of rage, of memory and loss. He was the first great mirror of the West, not because he taught, but because he revealed. Through Achilles, we see our fury. Through Odysseus, our cunning. Through Penelope, our patience. Through Hector, our nobility. We meet the parts of ourselves we try to hide, and the parts we hope to become. This is what separates Homer from myth. Myth is rigid, timeless, a tool for belief. But Homer's epics are stories. Stories that breathe, stories that doubt, stories that change. And because of that, they travel. From age to age, mind to mind, each generation finding something new in their old rhythms. To the Greeks, he was the cradle of culture. To the Romans, a guide for empire. To the medieval world, a mystery, whispered of but half known. To the Renaissance, a rediscovered light. And to the modern West, a haunting. Because as civilization grew more complex, so too did its reflection. In the Enlightenment, Homer was dissected, cataloged, revered for his form. In the Romantic era, he was fire, wild, visceral, proof that beauty and pain were sisters. By the time the 20th century arrived, bloodied by 2 wars, uncertain of itself, Homer returned, not as a comfort, but as a challenge. Poets and novelists, shattered by the collapse of meaning, turned again to the old voice. Not to imitate, but to reckon. James Joyce, in his Ulysses, did not simply retell the Odyssey. He reimagined it. A single day in Dublin. One man walking its streets. A journey not across seas, but through the quiet, harrowing oceans of ordinary life. Odysseus became Leopold Bloom. Penelope became Molly. The gods vanished, but memory remained. It was homage and rebellion. Because Homer was not a relic to be revered. He was a grammar for the soul, one that could be rewritten but never forgotten. Later came Derek Walcott, a poet from the Caribbean, heir not to Greece but to exile. He wrote Omeros, a fractured post-colonial epic, a poem of fishermen and ancestors, of the sea and slavery. And there too was Homer, not as master, but as witness. Proof that the old stories could hold new pain, new truth. Homer, it turns out, is not bound to any geography. He is not European, not Mediterranean. He is human. His epics belong to anyone who has loved and lost, anyone who has wandered far from home, or returned to find it changed. Anyone who has asked, was it worth it? The power of Homer is not that we believe him, it's that we feel him. In a line of verse, we hear the heartbeat of a warrior. In a quiet simile, the rustle of olive leaves. In a woman's silence, the toll of 10 years. His words are old, yes, but they are not distant. They are close, like breath, like a memory you forgot you carried. And they remind us, with subtle force, that the first stories still matter, because they ask the first questions. What is honor? What is home? What does it mean to be remembered? In that sense, Homer is not just a poet. He is the well we draw from, again and again, sometimes without knowing. He is the reason we believe in heroes, not the flawless kind, but the broken ones, the kind who bleed, the kind who weep. He is the echo behind every epic, every soldier's letter, every road movie, every whispered bedtime story that begins long ago in a time of war. And still, after all this time, we argue over him. Was he real? Was he one or many? Did he shape the stories or merely carry them? But maybe the better question is not who he was. Maybe it's this. Why do we still care? Why does a voice from 3,000 years ago still hold us in its grasp? Perhaps because, in some fundamental way, Homer didn't just tell us who the Greeks were. He told us who we are, our anger, our hope, our journeys, our songs. He built the first mirror and dared us to look. Not with shame, not with pride, just honestly. And what we saw was not perfect, but it was true. In the opening of the Odyssey, Homer calls Odysseus Polytropos, a man of many turns. Clever, wily, changeable. A man shaped by the roads he's walked, the lies he's told, the names he's worn. But what if that word applies not only to Odysseus? What if it applies to Homer himself? The man who was many. Because Homer, whoever he was, has never stood still. He changes with every age, every culture, every voice that dares to carry his song. He is the blind bard of Chios, the court poet of Smyrna, the wandering rhapsode, the shadow behind the scroll, the breath behind the page. Or perhaps he was none of these. Perhaps Homer is not a man, but a moment, a convergence, where memory becomes art, where myth becomes map, where grief becomes gold. And yet, we keep reaching for him. We want a face, a name, a body that walked in sandals along sunlit stones. We want to see him. Because if we could look him in the eye, perhaps we could ask, how did you know? How did you know what war feels like when the fires go out? How did you know what it means to wander so long that you no longer remember your own voice? How did you know the silence of a woman waiting? The weight of honor when no one is watching? The hollow echo of glory? But Homer gives no answers, only echoes. Perhaps he was one man, a genius, singular and blinding, who turned an entire tradition into thunder and honey. Or perhaps he was the crest of a wave, the high point of something far older, larger, shaped by centuries of voices no longer named. Maybe both are true, maybe neither. But what matters is not who he was. What matters is that he endures. Not just in texts, not in dusty classrooms or careful translations, but in the ways we tell stories, in the heroes we love, in the questions we still ask when the world grows quiet. Why do we fight? Why do we leave? Why do we come home? These questions are older than stone, and Homer gave them shape. Not with answers, but with song. A song that holds death, but also beauty. That mourns, but also remembers. That warns us not to trust the gods too much, but never forget them either. He was many things. Poet, prophet, phantom. But most of all, he was a beginning. The breath before the line. The hush before the story. The man, or memory, who stood at the mouth of a vast cave and sang the world awake. Even now, you can hear it. In the beat of a drum before a tale. In the hush of a cinema before the lights dim. In the silence between words when someone says, "Let me tell you a story." That's Homer, still walking the shores, still singing to the sea. Still watching us with eyes that may never have seen, but saw everything. He was the man who was many, and in each of us, a little of him remains. So much has passed since Homer's voice first stirred the air. Empires have risen, burned, and fallen into dust. Languages have died. Gods have been forgotten, maps redrawn, truth rewritten, and yet his words remain. Not because they are ancient, but because they are alive. They remind us that the human soul has always been restless, that we have always longed to be remembered, to make meaning of war, to survive the sea, to find our way home. Homer did not give us certainty. He gave us a mirror, and in it, we still see ourselves, raging, grieving, yearning, waiting. He taught us that glory is fleeting, but grief is honest, that the gods may be powerful, but it is the mortals who feel deeply, that the story is not in the ending, but in the telling. And so we carry his song, not as an artifact, but as a part of us, in the tales we pass down, in the journeys we take, in the names we whisper when the stars come out. Listen closely, and you'll still hear it. Not in Greek, not in scrolls, but in the quiet between heartbeats. Where memory lives, Homer is not gone. He is the voice that begins the tale, the silence that gives it weight, the song that never ends.